Hello and welcome to episode number 34 of Chel Squared. I'm your host, Andrew Chelney, and as per usual, we've got a ton to talk about today. Before we get into it here, please make sure to follow the podcast on Twitter at Chel Squared and on Facebook at Chel Squared for more hot takes, news by featured guests, poll questions, and a whole lot more. Please rate the show if you enjoy listening. It means a lot to me. And every time you ever like the show on SoundCloud, give it a rating on iTunes, follow it on Spotify, etc. A puppy gets a hug from its owner. I don't make the rules here, just making sure you are in the know. If you prefer listening to podcasts on YouTube, search Chel Squared Podcast and the show is there too. As the trade deadline keeps creeping closer and closer, the Columbus Blue Jackets are stuck in seemingly no man's land. Panarin will most likely not re-sign with the Jackets after this season. Neither will Sergei Bobrovsky. According to an article by Craig Costanz released via The Athletic today, Panarin's agent Dan Milstein basically said Panarin will hit the market on July 1st, and teams should be aware that, quote, he is going as a rental at best. So what should the Jackets do with both assets? Now, Columbus is currently holding on to the final wildcard spot in the East, 29-20-3 record, good for 61 points, 3 better than the Sabres and the Hurricanes, who are right behind them. So does that mean the Jackets will hold on, become buyers, and go for that one final push? Or is their recent 5-5 stretch mean they'll try to move some assets? We'll talk about that. Now, let's say the Blue Jackets make it to the playoffs with this exact team they have now. What are the playoff aspirations of this team exactly? I mean, how far will they go, and who are they likely to beat, if anybody? Remember, the Blue Jackets have never won a playoff series in their history and have entered the playoffs with better rosters than they have now, although the same could be said about the Capitals, of course, who won the Cup last season with arguably a much worse roster than they've had in previous years. Now, let's say the Blue Jackets are going to try one more time to make a deep run with Panarin and Bobrovsky still on the team. Who will they look to acquire, and where do the Jackets need the most help? We'll discuss that as we move along in the show. And say Bobrovsky hits the market on July 1st and signs somewhere else. Is 24-year-old Joonas Korpisalo good enough to be Columbus's number one goaltender? They have 22-year-old Matis Kivlenieks in Cleveland, but he's currently posting an .879 save percentage in 13 games this season. Who is the next guy up for Columbus, and how good is their prospect pipeline really? How is the future outlook of this team looking like? We'll get into all of that, the poll question, and a whole lot more. Joining Chel Square this week is Blue Jackets beat reporter for The Athletic, Alison Lukan. Alison, how are you?
I am great. That was a tremendous intro. You've covered all the bases. I don't know what I've left to
add. Well, before we get into the super nitty gritty here, I have an incredibly important $1 million question for you. So on top of covering the Jackets, you also write about OSU's men's and women's hockey teams. I don't know how you find the time for all that, to be completely honest with you. But while you travel, I'm sure you listen to some music. Now, I need to know, the world needs to know, who your guilty pleasure artist is. You won't get any judgment from me, I promise you, because my answer is probably worse than yours.
Oh my goodness, my guilty pleasure. Well, I'm pulling up my music library here to see who's been on there of late. I will admit I enjoy me some good Taylor Swift. Not gonna lie, trying to see who else I've got. I'm really jamming on some Bastille, which is apparently a hot topic band. You either love or hate them, which was news to me. But I'm a little more old school, so I'll always bring out some Backstreet Boys, some Whitney Houston. I'll go an 80s route any day of the week.
Some classics for sure. I have to say my guilty pleasure has to be Pink. I mean,
good call.
I'm a huge metalhead. I love metal. I'm seeing Slayer again in May. But I do love me some other genres as well. I'm into EDM and I'm into a huge Michael Jackson fan as well. But I love Pink's approach to the way that she carries herself and the way that she approaches her music. She's this incredible singer. She doesn't care what anyone thinks of her. She's so talented, and I feel like more people should be listening to her. I know she's incredibly popular already, but I feel like she should be more popular just because her music is really good. She's an incredible talent, and her music is fantastic. And it's weird that it's a guilty pleasure, right? Because Pink is so good, and yet I feel like it has to be a guilty pleasure because Pink isn't one of those artists that off top of your head scream, this is one of the artists that you should be listening to, even though you should, right? I at least I feel like you should.
Listen. Pink's fantastic. One of my
thank you.
Even when she broke out, and I agree with you. I think here's the thing with her too, is that her music is good and it's all created by her, right? And then on top of it, as a performer, she's out of this world with all her acrobatics and things like that. Like, she's the complete package.
Yes. I recently watched one of her live concerts, and the things that she does on stage is absolutely incredible. And I'm very glad we're on the same page here. Of course, Whitney Houston and the Backstreet Boys. I mean, you can't go wrong with the classics, right? Backstreet Boys, I guess, are a classic group now. Now that they've been disbanded for over a decade, I think, right?
Who knows anymore?
They get back together once every couple of years on some show.
Exactly.
That's that's very true. So the Columbus Blue Jackets here, Panarin is a question mark. His agent, as I said in the opening, just came out and basically said he's hitting the market. Whoever gets him as a rental he is just a rental, no matter where he's going. From what it sounds like, Bobrovsky is a big question mark. What have you seen from both of these players? I'm sure you've talked to them recently. What does their body language say? What is the situation revolving these two players right now in Columbus?
Yeah, so it's really quite interesting that it's two very different stories. And I'll start with Bobrovsky because he's probably the most interesting of the two. I mean, Bobrovsky comes to Columbus, wasn't getting any playing time in Philadelphia, a steal of a trade by then GM Scott Howson. In retrospect, this is a player who goes on to, as everyone knows, win 2 Vezinas. There were a lot of years where this team rode Bobrovsky to their winning record. He deserves a ton of credit for where the organization is today. He's been a big, big part of that. He's beloved by fans. There's a tradition in Blue Jackets land where at the end of every win, Captain Nick Foligno and Sergei Bobrovsky have a big on-ice hug, and it's celebrated. But the flip of that has been that Bobrovsky hasn't been stellar in the postseason. And I think that at this point, he feels like he's not being appreciated enough for all he's done to get this team into one that talks about regularly going to the postseason. And it's a difficult subject to talk to a player like that who maybe doesn't want to really dive into what's gone on in some of those postseason games. So there's been some rough conversations. His last contract negotiation was a bit contentious through his agent. And so he comes into this season and basically at the start of training camp made a statement to the media that was a very different tone than what we've known from Bobrovsky. He's always been smiling, congenial, very focused, probably the hardest worker on the team. But he came in very serious and basically said, I'm going to play my season. The front office knows what my situation is, and that's all I'm going to say about it. Very closed about follow-up questions. And there hasn't really been much optimism on this front. The player was benched. Some say suspended without calling it a suspension for a game because he was pulled from a game in Tampa Bay and did not return to the bench. The players had to intervene, and it ended up that they asked Bobrovsky to stay away from the rink for a game. There's been some more ups and downs in his play this season. So that's been a little bit of a harder one. And I think that once the player is gone, I think fans are going to realize what a big impact that is, not just for his play, but also just what he's meant to this franchise. So it's a weird kind of sad or bittersweet, what we seem to believe is an ending. I don't think there's much chance that we see Bobrovsky in a Blue Jacket sweater definitely come next season. Not sure about at the deadline. And Panarin's a different story. Panarin is acquired in trade, comes to Columbus. The wrinkle with him is that when he was in Chicago provided him with a translator at all times. So when he came to Columbus, it was advised that the translators should not be provided and that Panarin would find a way to learn English. Well, he hasn't really made himself available to the media. We hear from him maybe one or two times a season, and that's always through a translator. And one of those times was also at the beginning of training camp. The news broke right around the draft that this player was not going to enter extension discussions with the Blue Jackets, which I think came as a huge shock. He seemed to fit in. He seemed to fit in the room. He seemed to fit in with coaches. He seemed to fit in with the city. And then when he came to camp, he made a similar statement, but with a much more congenial tone than Bobrovsky, kind of joking, smiling his way through it. I just want to wait and see my options. I'm not saying I'm not going to stay, but I'm not saying I'm going to stay. But again, we don't really get to talk to him much at all. And kind of the final nail in the coffin came with the statement from his agent here over the All-Star break and bye weeks when they said ever so politely, we're still not willing to discuss extensions at this time, which for any of us who've had any sort of dating experience in high school or college knows you better read the writing on the wall there. So, I think he is arguably, actually both of these players are probably the two most talented to ever come through Columbus. I would argue that Panarin is actually the most talented to ever come through Columbus. And the challenge is now, what do you do? Do you keep that player or do you try and get something back for him? As you said, knowing that this is a player who, by all right, he is one of the top talents in the game. No team has shown him loyalty prior. Chicago traded him to Columbus. So he has every right to say, I'm going to wait till the summer and see what I can get from the places I want to play. And I'm happy to play for you and put out my best, which he has done in Columbus, a consummate professional. But I think that's a guy who's going to wait to see where he can get not just the biggest bang for the buck, but also be in a place where he wants to play. I think that's a big thing for him as well.
So you said that Panarin, as a quick aside, Panarin is the best talent to come through Columbus. So you would take prime Panarin over a prime Rick Nash per se?
They're such different players, right? And the game is so different.
Right.
I mean, with full marks to Rick Nash and what he did for the franchise, I think that, yes, Panarin is the best talent to come through the franchise.
And there are some rumors going around, none of which may or may not be super concrete, but there were some rumblings going on social media a few days ago that perhaps Florida would be interested in trading for Bobrovsky. Now, again, I don't know, one, if Bobrovsky is willing to go to Florida, and two, Florida has a lot of money tied up in Luongo and James Reimer. Have you heard of any sort of truth to that? Is there anything to back up the rumors that there could be a Florida Columbus swap involving Bobrovsky?
Yeah, I think particularly with, my colleagues who are reporting it, there's certainly quite enough smoke to believe that there have been some conversations. The key with Bobrovsky versus Panarin is this is a player who, when next season starts, he's going to be 31 years old. So, and he's a goalie, right? So this is arguably his last contract. And if he is with the team with which he signs as of the trade deadline, he can sign for 8 years. And again, two-time Vezina winner, you're looking at potentially an additional $8 to $10 million, depending on what kind of deal he would negotiate. So there could be incentive on the player's side to make a trade to be in a place where he wants to be so he can get that 8th year when he signs his extension. And, that might also be part of it for Florida, is that's an additional enticement to offer the player why they should come to Florida. And it also says, hey, you're here now and we get in before maybe some of the other bigger fish come in and we get into a bidding war. So I think it's possible, but you're right, because with the goaltender situation Florida has, you have to think that they're going to want Reimer perhaps going the other way in that trade. That's a quandary for Columbus of how they handle that in return. Otherwise, they're going to have to be doing a lot of money movement, a buyout, or who knows what to stick with just two goaltenders if they make that trade. They're going to have to do it regardless if they get Bobrovsky in the offseason. But I think it could make sense. And it sounds like the two sides definitely have talked.
So this team right now is 5-5 in their last 10 games, right? They're 3 points clear of a spot right now. They are in their final wild card spot, but the Hurricanes are right behind. The Sabres are right behind. They've been kind of 500 for the past little while now. In your opinion, are they taking Panarin? Are they taking Bobrovsky? And are they adding and then just going for one final push to see where they can go with these two superstars? Or are they looking at, okay, well, let's at least test the market. Maybe we can move one of these guys before they leave. And we get nothing in return, and then try to build for next season and beyond. What's the best option for Columbus in your opinion with that?
It's so hard. I mean, this is you could not pay me to have to do what Jarmo Kekalainen, the GM, is going to have to do here in the next
Tough
couple
job
weeks.
for Jarmo, for sure.
Indeed, I if I were Jarmo, and this has not been said to me directly, but you have to think that there's a price that would make losing either player make sense. And if, this is negotiation in any business, is if your price is met, then you make the move. You get what you feel the asset is worth and you make the move. I wouldn't be surprised if those are conversations that Jarmo and his team have had. Because if you can get back what you feel you need, it's worth it to make the move. Even if Panarin and Bobrovsky stay, which I think also could happen, I do think that they are still adding assets, barring some major catastrophe here in the next couple weeks. It's crazy, but this team also kind of faltered right before the deadline between the All-Star game and the trade deadline last year. It was exactly at this time last year that they had 5 straight losses, just like they just came off of this season. So there might be a little bit of mental stuff going on. This is a very young team. I think they're still the youngest in the league. Last year, they brought in a couple pieces at the trade deadline, and that was when they really just amped it up. So I could see, as long as they can stick around, I think assets are going to be added regardless. And above and beyond that, I think it's going to have to be pure straight negotiation, in that if they can get what they want for either player without hurting the organization too significantly, one or both are gone.
Well, do the Blue Jackets have the assets to trade futures or a prospect, if in that case, for a second line center or a top 4 defenseman? Or where in the team do you feel this team deserves another player that can bolster either the blue line, the forwards? I mean, Bobrovsky and Korpisalo haven't really been playing well this season, as I'm sure you know. Right. I mean, you've been watching and following the team all year, as I assume both goaltenders haven't been playing that well. I mean, do they look at acquiring another goaltender, kind of like a third string, just kind of to hold the fort in case both goalies have another bad stretch? Or do they, which position, in your opinion, needs help right now?
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right with where you started. Particularly if Bobrovsky goes, they're going to need to get a goalie. I don't know if that's, a Howard from Detroit, who would be an optimum scenario in my mind, because this is a player on the last year of a deal, pure rental, but could play well and help be a backbone to this team. Or is it, the situation we discussed earlier of, is Bernier coming back, or are you making a move for a Jonathan Quick? Or do you look to your pipeline? There's you mentioned Matisse Kivlenix, who's in Cleveland. Jackets, people who follow the Jackets are really excited about a young man named Elvis Merzlikins, who is playing over in Europe. He signed a contract that prevented him from even getting out of it to play in the NHL or in North America in any context. But that contract expires with his season over there. And all the scouting reports just rave about him. And there's anticipation. This is a kid who could come over and make a difference, particularly if his season ends before the NHL season. But barring the goaltending question, the two places this team really needs help, in my opinion, is first down the middle. Alexander Wenberg has not really performed up to expectations as a center. He had a great year 2 years ago, last year wasn't good, but he was kind of pocked by injuries quite a bit. But this year he just hasn't seemed to be able to return to his groove. So if they want to make a run, they definitely need another strong center in play. And the other place I think they would need to add is on the blue line. Last year, I mentioned they added some folks at the deadline. One of those was Ian Cole. And I think they would have really liked to have him back. He opted to end up going to Colorado. But I think they would need another infusion like that of a sturdy veteran defenseman who can bolster a third pair, a second pair, and then also, again, bring kind of that experience-based voice to the locker room.
Alex Wenberg, I mean, I'm looking at his stats right now, 59 points in 16-17, 13 goals, mostly an assist guy. He has 2 goals and 20 assists in 52 games this season. I mean, if Columbus needs scoring, which I'm sure, I mean, obviously you want to score more goals in their team. That's the point, right? Wenberg clearly isn't providing enough of that. So is there an underlying reason as to why that is? Is he holding his stick a little too tightly? Is he just getting bad bounces? I mean, he hasn't really been the sniper in his career, but he's had more than 2 goals, right? And it seems like he's having just kind of a super down year for any sort of reason. Is there any particular reason that you can point to that says, okay, this could be the reason why Wenberg is underperforming the way he is?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple. I mean, one is the circumstance of this team right now is that the power play has just been on the whole for, almost a year and a half here now, if not a little longer, just abysmal. It's starting to come around of late, but it's really just been bad. And then last year when people would ask, where did the goals go? Well, they went 2 places. They went to a lot of dropped shooting percentages and they went to just a woeful power play. So I think that's the easier part of this is that's a systemic problem that they're trying to fix. But the knock on poor Wenberg is that the guy doesn't shoot. Mm-hmm. He doesn't take a lot of shots. And he had a power play goal in the last game against Colorado, right, and he had exactly 1 shot. So, but you mentioned he is a playmaker. He is a talented playmaker.
Picky shooter. I mean, right? If he sees a shot, he'll take it. But he's not one of those volume shooters, I guess.
Well, he actually, poor guy, he actually will see a shot and elect to pass. So he's perhaps passing up those opportunities. And I think this is a little bit of the cliche that we sometimes hear of, you can't get any luck. If you wanted to buy some, you couldn't get any luck. He told my colleague, Tom Reed, lately, I think the quote was, you have to create your own luck. And right now I have no way to do that. It was along those lines. So I think there's some confidence here too. And I did mention the injuries. It's far from me to say these guys are far tougher physically than I, but with injuries, is he as willing to go into the battles, the one-on-one battles, is he as willing to scrap it out in the corners? And if you're not, then you're not even getting the puck on your stick as much, let alone having a chance to take shots.
Yeah, I mean, prior to last game, he had 1 goal in 51 games. That's Cody McLeod had the same amount of goals this season. He played not 51 games. That's for sure. Yes. That trade was interesting. The Rangers got Cody McLeod for free from waivers and then traded McLeod to the same team for a draft pick. That's an incredible deal. Gordon, you are a mastermind, and Rangers are glad to have Rangers are glad to have you. Going back to the goalies for a second here, both goalies, as we said earlier, are just not playing well. Both goalies actually have identical save percentages at .901, which I don't have to tell you this, obviously, but .901 isn't going to get it done in the NHL in this era. In this modern era, that's not good enough, nearly not good enough to be a goaltending on a team that has high playoff expectations. And with Bobrovsky, it makes a little bit more sense because of the contract thing. There might be some off-ice stuff that we don't know about. I mean, I don't know, but I would assume the contract is weighing on him, and that there's particular, at least part of the reason why he's not playing as well as we know that he can. But Korpisalo is 901 save percentage. I mean, he had even a lower save percentage last year at 897 in 18 games played. I mean, is Korpisalo good enough to, let's say, Bobrovsky hits the free agent market July 1st, and they choose and they elect to go with Jonas as the starting goaltender for the Columbus Blue Jackets? Is he good enough to do that, or in your opinion, should they look at acquiring another goaltender?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that right now he is not a number one NHL goaltender. The questions you're asking are the same questions the team had hoped to answer this year. Coming into this year, the organization was very straightforward that Korpisalo was going to get more playing time this year so that they could really figure out what they had in him. I mean, this is a guy who was a big part of the Cleveland Monsters Calder Cup season when he was the number one there. So, you know, he's done it at levels prior to the NHL, but he hasn't been able to find his consistency. This is a guy who will have moments or games of brilliance, but then also just some faltering or you know, a lapse where a goal always gets in. So I don't know yet that he isn't a number one, but I feel like I know that he isn't a number one right now. So to that, you know, as we talked about before, I do think if Bob is to get moved this season, they would have to bring in someone who is a proven entity in terms of standing up in net to work with Korpisalo as a tandem. It can't be just handing it over to Korpisalo, unless I'm missing some completely crazy scenario we haven't talked
right.
about. But yeah, he's gonna need support there. There's still the opportunity he could become a number one, but he's still working towards that level in his play.
Well, let's say this exact team, or, you know, add a bottom six player or seventh defenseman or whatever. Let's say this exact team gets into the playoffs. Can they realistically beat anyone else that is in a playoff spot right now? I mean, can they beat the Boston Bruins? Can they beat the Pittsburgh Penguins? Can they beat the Islanders? Can they beat Washington? Can they beat any of these teams that are currently in a playoff spot? And is it realistic to think that they could win with the rush that they currently have, with Bobrovsky not playing well, with Korpisalo not playing well? Is it realistic to imagine the possibility that they will finally break the curse and win a playoff series this season, or should we hold back on that until the goaltending gets fixed, the Panarin situation gets resolved? Should we hold off on that, or is there some sort of magic that could happen and they finally win a playoff series this year?
And this is not much changes, right? So Bob and Panarin are still with the team.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, listen, this is why we play the games, right? I mean, right. I do think that as constructed, if they're playing at their best, this is a team that can win a playoff round. I think it'd be a lot easier if they added those pieces I mentioned. I think that they could do it. And it could be a Washington type scenario where once you get that first monkey off your back, the rest of it becomes relatively easier, particularly mentally, and you're able to go on a run. But I don't know that I'd say they're going to make, you know, this grand push all the way to the Cup final. But I think that this group, as constructed, could at least win a round. Yes.
Well, the poll question that I tweeted out today was, how will Columbus finish this season? The poll got over 75 votes, and the four choices were miss the playoffs, lose in the first round, lose in the second round, and I could only have four choices here, so I had to kind of summarize the last one with contend for the Cup. Now, in your opinion, which of the four is most likely to happen at the end of this season?
Oh, read them to me. The last one was contend for the Cup. Read the first three to me again.
So the four options are they're going to miss the playoffs, they're going to lose in the first round, lose in the second round, or they're going to contend for the Cup. Okay,
I you know what? I am always the optimist. I'm going to say they would lose in the second round. That's my vote.
That option has 7% of the poll votes. lose in the first round, above and beyond the leader right now with 66% of the votes. Miss the playoffs is second with 25% of the votes. Lose in the second round is third with 7%. And I guess one or two people actually chose contend for the cup. 2% of the vote has contend for the cup, which is pretty optimistic. I can't argue otherwise. It is definitely. I mean, again, a lot of people discounted the Capitals after last season, right? Because again, right. the roster wasn't as good as it was before. The idea was, okay, well, they're clearly not as good, so they'll probably bounce in the first round or second round again, and then the rest will snowball from there. But then they won the cup, so I guess you never truly know what's going to happen with certain teams. But I would have to agree with the poll. I do think that if they do make the playoffs, they're going to lose in the first round, only because I feel like a big reason behind what I think is the goaltending. If Bobrovsky was playing even marginally better, I would have a much better feeling of Columbus at least pushing up their first playoff series to 6 or 7 games or on the opposite end, actually, come out of a playoff round without having to go 7 games and winning that series. But because Bobrovsky, as you said, hasn't been that phenomenal in the playoffs, and he hasn't been good this season at all either, I would have to assume that if they make the playoffs, they're not going to win a round unless, of course, Bobrovsky turns a switch and becomes the opposite of how he's been playing for the past year. And just plays extremely well and carries the team to the second round. But I would have to say that if everything else equals 0 and Bobrovsky continues to play the way that he is now, I would have to say that if they do make the playoffs, which I'm assuming will happen. However, again, with the losing streak that the Blue Jackets have been on recently, and Carolina playing well, it's not a sure thing, I would say. I mean, what do you think about it being a sure thing? Obviously, nothing is a sure thing in the league until you have the X next to your team name. That's a given. But judging by the standings right now, how confident are you that they are going to make the playoffs with the rosters that they have now?
Yeah, this is why we follow this stuff, right? The drama of it all. Just listening to you lay out. Yeah, I do think that they will make the postseason. I mentioned nothing, as you said, nothing is for sure, but we have seen with this team that if they can get through the trade deadline, that for whatever reason, they kind of just loosen up after that and really find their game. You're right on the goaltending, no question, but I think that they've been serviceable enough to at least stay constant through the regular season, so they will make the playoffs. There's no, unless they trade Bobrovsky, trade Panarin, and make no moves back, I really do think that they'll make the postseason. I don't want to say easily, but I think that they're not going to be crawling and scratching for points like in games 81 and 82.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's totally a fair, that's a fair opinion. There's definitely a lot of what we've seen in Columbus that suggests that they will make the playoffs, but of course with Columbus with Carolina kind of chewing at the ankles here a little bit. I mean, Buffalo is right there also, but ever since that 10-game win streak, they've been pretty abysmal. I mean, they won against Minnesota in the last game when they played tonight against Carolina. That game is going to be huge for standings wise. The two teams with 58 points that are going to play today, and that will dictate a big, I think, a big swing in the race for the wild card. Obviously, there's still 30 games to go, so it might not make a whole lot of difference. But of course, every point, especially with how tight the race is, obviously every point is important. But let's say the Blue Jackets are willing to spend a high draft pick or a prospect on a top player. Are they in a position to do that? What are their what are their futures looking like? And how set are they in terms of 2-3 years down the road? Can these prospects or futures play for this team and play well?
Yeah, it's the pipeline is always a fun one to watch because we talk about negotiation. There's negotiation and then there's gambling, which is really what your prospect pipeline is. And I think they have a couple interesting pieces. Sonny Milano, who was a first round pick not too long ago, has kind of struggled trying to find his footing at the NHL level. So he's a talented player, and he may be someone who, for the right return, is worth parting with to give him a change of scenery and see if that kind of helps shake it loose. Trying to think who else. There's not any really big names, which is what happens when you start to get better and better. So you don't have those high picks down there. A player I think they might be less likely to part with is Vitaly Abramov. This is a young man from Russia, played in the Q, extremely talented, over 100 points in the Q 2 seasons in a row, but couldn't come to the AHL last year because of the Q and AHL agreement. He's a little small, so I think he's still finding his game in the A, but I don't know that that's someone they'd be willing to part with. There's some other pieces down there, and they, of course, have draft picks just like everyone else does. And as we know, this time of year, you're not really looking at big-time gives in exchange for rentals, which is what I think any acquisitions would be for this team.
Well, they do have their first-round pick this season. They don't have their second, their fifth, or their sixth this year. So right now they have 4 draft picks in total in this year's draft. So if they do wanted to move draft picks for a rental, they would either have to go to next year, and even then they don't have next year's third-round pick. They would have to, if unless they want to move their first round pick, which, again, as much as we've been talking, that it would make the most sense that if they were a first round exit sort of team, they should probably hold on to their first round pick at least for this year. And which tells me that if they were to go for a rental, they can't. They really shouldn't anyway. Trade their first round pick for a rental, and I'm assuming that's kind of the plan here is to trade for a couple pieces here and there to kind of fill out the roster, especially with Dubinsky now going on IR, to kind of replace him for at least a little bit, right? But I would assume that the plan is they're going to keep at least their high draft picks and not go for anybody crazy. Is that right to assume?
Yeah, and Dubinsky is not on IR yet. He's left the team. He's headed back to Columbus to get an MRI, but still officially, as of right now, day to day. But your point is well taken. This is where all these pieces moving around is what's going to help answer that question, because I agree. If Panarin and Bobrovsky are with this team, you're not giving up your first round pick. However, one could contemplate that one or both of those players leaving the team in trade would involve at least one first round pick coming back, right? And if that is the case, you now have potentially more first round draft picks in addition to possibly other additional round draft picks. And you're also looking for higher end talent where you'd be willing, or perhaps better said, required to give up a first round pick. So I think the context is going to matter here. If Bob and Panarin stay, you've outlined exactly what the scenario is. They're not in a place to give up that first round pick. But if they move, I think they probably have more. And one might move if it's a player they really like.
Well, the Jackets the Jackets right now have, I'm going to approximate here, $6.5 million in cap space according to Cap Friendly, right? So let's say the cap is increased by $3 million for the next season. So let's say hypothetically they have now $9.5 million. And then you take Panarin's contract out of the equation, that's $15.5 million. And then you take Bobrovsky's contract out of the equation, let's approximate, and let's say $7.5 million for him as well, which leads around $26 million of cap space. I'm not good at math, so I'm not going to say the exact number here, and I'm not going to I'm not gonna take out a calculator or anything. That's not happening. Let's say they have around $26 million in cap space, and they don't really have a whole lot of players to re-sign either that require big contracts. Besides, Korpisalo is going to be an RFA, but he's not going to demand nearly as big of a contract as Bobrovsky had this season, and you need to sign Ryan Murray, but again, he's making almost $3 million this season. I'm assuming he's going to need some sort of increase, but not huge either. So let's say, and you also have Lucas Sedlak that needs a new contract, and again, these are minor salary increases, but not huge contracts. Let's say a Toronto needs to do. So let's say after all of that, they have around $20 million in cap space to play around with. That potentially leads to some big names maybe being enticed to play for Columbus. Maybe a Matt Duchene, whose contract is expiring at the end of this season. The contract talks, from what I know on social media that's being reported, isn't going superbly. And Columbus is in a position to give him a lot of money if Duchene so chooses, and that would help a lot with Columbus's center problem, especially with Wenberg not scoring nearly as much as Columbus would hope that he does. Is Columbus now gearing up to be in a position where they go to July 1st and say, okay, theoretically a blank check. Obviously that doesn't work in reality, but let's say theoretically here's a blank check. We're going to go out and we're going to sign some big names, some big talents to prove to the city, to our fans, and to the rest of the league that, hey, we're not going anywhere. We are still a competitive hockey team.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think that what you're, and that might be, to your point, that might be why particularly again, if they can move, this is the benefit of moving a Panarin or a Bobrovsky, is they can trade to get a Duchene or someone into the organization now to start those conversations even before July 1, right? To have that, just like we talked about Florida doing that, to have an advantage with Bobrovsky, it'd be a similar scenario for Columbus. But I think what they're going to want to do is they're going to want to nail down Ryan Murray. He is, as you said, going to be up for a pay raise. He's played tremendously well this year, and he's, of course, a former second overall pick. And they've got to sign Zach Werenski, who I think is going to get some good money there, as deserved.
Right.
They'll probably want to get those two deals locked up and then see what they have to play with, and bring in a name, not just for the talent, but for reinforcing that this is a competitive club. This is a club that is ready to make a push, and to show, the rest of the hockey world that these two players leaving didn't break us and doesn't say anything about what this organization is about, what this city is about. I think it's going to be important on a couple different levels for sure. And they will have, people who have dinged the Jackets for maybe not trading Panarin and Bobrovsky, as you outlined, the asset back that they would get should they keep both is cap space, and quite a bit, that could be used to their advantage, obviously.
There's a lot of big names that are unrestricted free agents come July 1st, right? Obviously, besides Panarin, Bobrovsky, and besides Duchene, you have Erik Karlsson, who is, I would assume is staying in San Jose, but again, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. That's the saying. So you can't assume anything until it's official. But I would think that Karlsson stays in San Jose, but of course we don't know for sure yet. And you have Mark Stone, who's been rumored to be on the block. And of course, the rumors and what is factually going on might very well be two totally different things here. But I would assume that Ottawa will be sellers because, again, they're at the bottom of the Eastern Conference and they're not They're not doing anything anytime soon. And if Mark Stone really values Ottawa, I guess what Ottawa could do is trade him, and then he could re-sign back in Ottawa at the end of the season if that's the path that he wants to go to. But there's a lot of big names here. You have Joe Pavelski, who's a little bit older at 34, but that could be an option that Columbus chooses to look at because he's a little bit older, because he could teach the young guys who don't have a lot of experience in the postseason to kind of bring in that locker room mentality of an older leader that is still very good at hockey. Also, you still need that. I mean, leaders off the ice are great, but if they could also be good at hockey, that would also be a bonus as well. There's some really good names as well. Jordan Eberle, I mean, again, 29 years old. There's some rumbling. Again, I say rumblings and some rumors. Take that with many grains of salt here, because again, what is reported or tweeted or whatever isn't what could very well be going on. But Jordan Eberle could potentially leave the Islanders at the end of the season if we don't know for sure. That could also be a name that the Columbus Blue Jackets could be looking at. I mean, there are some big names here that Columbus could very well attract and could make a lot of sense for this very young, as you said, and inexperienced Blue Jackets team. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, it's funny, as you were rattling off the names, I was flipping to the situation we've talked about getting someone at the trade deadline instead and not having to go to July 1 to get some of those talents. Pavs doesn't really move the needle for me. I think that they are looking for something a little different. If this was a different team, maybe he comes in, but I think to your point, you need not just good at hockey, you need the really good at hockey, the producing points at hockey kind of guy. But the other names are certainly interesting. I mean, Duchesne is a name that Columbus was rumored to be in on earlier before he went to Ottawa. You have to have a conversation with Mark Stone if you can. It's going to be either a super active trade deadline or perhaps the most active that this organization will try to be in free agency in maybe ever, you might say. It would be a very interesting summer.
I mean, I don't know if you've been, I'm sure you've been on Twitter today, but the NBA trade deadline was today. Yeah. And the amount of panic and just absolute chaos on the timeline today was incredible. As I mean, this time of year is for hockey fans is incredible. For general managers, I mean, I don't know how some of these GMs still have hair. I mean, I know. It's incredible how stressful this is for them and fans like myself, and as I'm sure you are as well. At the end of the day, if you weren't a fan of hockey, then this job would be a lot more difficult for you, as you know, as you well know. But fans can't really put into perspective how difficult it is to be a GM in this league. But of course, I feel like this has to be said that we could probably with an asterisk, do a better job than Peter Chiarelli. Now, with that said, Jarmo does definitely has a lot of crossroads right ahead of him, and the deadline is just over 2 weeks away on February 25th, and today is February 7th, of course. Less than 2 weeks away. He doesn't have a whole lot of time to think it over. What, in your opinion, gets done? If you were Jarmo for these next couple of weeks here, what do you think would be the best thing to do for the organization for this season and beyond?
Well, before the bye week, I would have said find a way for Panarin to sign. But you know, I mean, this is why he is a GM, in that, you know, I think that he and his team have been evaluating scenarios and evaluating where the decision points are, where the thresholds are, even perhaps before Panarin first came out with his message this summer. So I do think that, as I said, I think they've established a price for each player. They're going to hope to get it. And if they get it, I think they would probably take it. And then I think that they would probably definitely make a swing for a defenseman. Maybe and a center. I was trying to see if I felt one was a stronger need over the other, and I don't know that I can say one over the other. I think that, again, with some of the names we've thrown around, I mean, if a Duchesne is even in the realm of possibility, I think that's a very serious conversation you have. If you can shore back up not only a need of your team now, but also help to replenish the talent you're losing with Panarin and Bob in one fell swoop, I think that's something that could happen. But I think there's going to be at least a couple pieces coming back to this organization regardless. And I will say at least one of Bobrovsky and Panarin is gone by the end of the deadline.
That's interesting. See now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put notifications on for every hockey insider. And I now see, like, now you've got me thinking about all these potential places he could go and what could happen. I mean, these next couple of weeks, as I said, are very exciting for everyone that isn't directly involved in the making of these trades.
Right, exactly.
Really quick here before I let you go, it's been almost an hour, and I really appreciate you taking the time once again. Earlier this week, the Penguins and the Panthers made a trade. It was a pretty big trade. The Penguins got Nick Bjugstad and Jared McCann from the Florida Panthers for forward Derek Brassard, Riley Sheahan, a second-round pick and a fourth-round pick in this year's draft. Was Derek Brassard ever on the radar for the Blue Jackets? I mean, Brassard has, in history, been a pretty serviceable player, to say the least. I mean, he was a very good Ranger from what I could remember watching him. But he's been having a pretty bad year in Pittsburgh, and he just didn't live up to expectations. And now he's being moved to Florida. Is Brassard, was he ever on the Columbus's radar? Is he still on the radar? Would he be a player that you could acquire for not as much as potentially a couple of years ago? Because he did fetch Mika Zibanejad in return and a second-round pick, and the Rangers very much won that trade. I mean, Mika Zibanejad, point-a-game player right now. He's their best forward by far, with Kreider and Zuccarello and all those guys trailing behind, not by much, but Zibanejad by far their best player right now. But Brassard looks like he was in need of a change of scenery. Is he still potentially on Columbus's radar? Could he be a serviceable player for the Blue Jackets?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you brought that up. It completely slipped my mind. I mean, and that is another wrinkle to why the conversations with Florida could make sense, right? Is getting a Brassard back. People talk about his time in New York, and they forget he had some good years in Columbus too, on what was not actually a very good Columbus team.
Right.
And I think what else makes this interesting is that when Brassard was traded, he was traded to New York, and Tortorella was the head coach there at the time. And everyone thought, oh gosh, this is not going to go well. And the two actually really hit it off. And that is another sign that the player could come to Columbus and perhaps find success. For me, I think they're still interested in him. I think he could provide value. For me, what I think has been interesting, and I haven't dug into this, I need to scratch at this with some of my colleagues based in Pittsburgh a little bit more, is that my read on his season, not even so much his production, which I think is certainly worth digging into. Why did the numbers drop? I know there was some question of where he was playing, who he was playing with, but also the injuries. I felt like I heard of quite a few injuries for him or missing games due to issues. In a weird way, that might actually be just slightly more important to me than understanding what happened with his game, because I think it's one of those situations. If you listen to what Jim Rutherford said after the move, it just wasn't a fit, and that happens. We know that happens. So I'd like to understand his overall health. But it's a player the organization knows, not necessarily this front office intimately, but he's been here. And if he were to come to Columbus, he knows this organization too. Now it's matured and grown since he was here, but that familiarity could be a big asset as well. And if you can't get a Duchesne, getting a Brassard is not a bad plan B.
Yeah, I would feel like there is a considerable drop from Duchesne to Brassard, at least looking at it right now, because of how much of an underperforming season Brassard has had leading up to today. I mean, of course, next season he could, after rehabbing whatever it is has been ailing him, he could come back and be the player that he once was in Columbus and in New York and sort of in Ottawa. But if you had to pick between Matt Duchesne and Derek Brassard, I feel like you would pick Duchesne. I would pick Duchesne.
For sure.
But at least I feel like hopefully most people would choose Matt Duchesne. And really quickly here, last little point here. Brian Boyle, of course, was traded from the Devils to the Predators for a second round pick. Was he potentially a name that could have bolstered the middle for the Blue Jackets? I mean, the second round pick is kind of high. I thought a little bit of a high price for Brian Boyle. Obviously, he's great off the ice, but on the ice he hasn't really been that the scorer or the point getter or insert whatever here that people want to insert about Brian Boyle. I mean, obviously, of course, fantastic player off the ice. I'm assuming I've never talked to him, but I assume from what I've heard that he's a terrific human being. But second round pick I thought was a little bit high for him. I mean, even if Columbus wanted to trade a draft pick to get Boyle, they had to trade next year's second round draft pick to get him if you were going by the same price here. Was Brian Boyle a name that you thought could have helped this team?
Yeah, I agree with you. I thought the price was high, and I don't think this is a fit in Columbus. When I talked about Brassard too, I certainly don't think he could replace a Duchesne, but I think he could work in the context of this team in this moment. Part of why this team needs a stronger center is because they have a lot of bottom six guys and they need some more top six guys. So I've heard the same as you. My impression is the same, that Brian Boyle is a tremendous human and a tremendous asset to a team in terms of their culture and how they're working off the ice. But I do not think that's someone that Columbus would have been seeking after, particularly right now.
That's very fair. Alison, this has been an incredible conversation. I really, truly appreciate you taking the time out of your extremely busy schedule. I mean, the Blue Jackets played about 2.5 hours, and we're sitting here talking some hockey, and I really appreciate taking the time out. I mean, you cover the Blue Jackets and the Ohio State men's hockey team and the Ohio State the Ohio State women's team as well. I mean, I don't know how you have time to sleep and much less talk some hockey with me, and I really appreciate you taking the time out. What's your social media? Where can people read your stuff? And this has been truly incredible. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thanks. I appreciate you seeking me out, and it's always fun to talk a little bit of Blue Jackets, and I appreciate you mentioning the Ohio State coverage as well. Those are some exciting teams people should check out. But you can find me on Twitter. It's at Alison L, and my name has just one L, so that's at ALISONL. And then my work is over at The Athletic. You can go to theathletic.com. And if you want to see where most of my stuff is housed, it's housed under the Blue Jackets. So if you select under Teams Blue Jackets, that's pretty much my home base. And we'd love to have you come check out our stuff, comment, let us know what you like, what you don't like, what you're interested in seeing more of, and we'll hopefully give that right back to our readers.
Awesome. Alison, thank you so much again for coming on, and I'll talk to you again real soon. And this has been awesome. Really appreciate you taking the time out once again.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. Good to talk with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And this has been episode number 34 of Chel Squared. I'm your host, Andrew Chelney. Episode number 35 coming out next week. I'll talk to you then.